Hello and welcome again to Film History MOOC teaching video 4. Soviet Silent Cinema and the Theory of Montage, 1917 to 1931. Introduction. Pre-revolutionary cinema. The history of cinema in pre-Soviet Russia was a neglected subject. When Russia entered World War I in August 1914, foreign films could no longer be imported, and the Tsarist government established the Skobelev Committee to stimulate domestic production and produce propaganda in support of the regime. When the Tsar fell in March 1917, the provisional government, headed by Alexander Kerensky, reorganized it to produce anti-Tsarist propaganda. When the Bolsheviks inherited the committee 8 months later, they transformed it into the Cinema Committee of the People's Commissariat of Education. Vladimir Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders see the cinema as a means of unifying the nation. As a minority party has about 200,000 members. The Bolsheviks controlled 160 million people across Russia. Those people spoke more than 100 separate languages and were mostly illiterate. Lenin was the first political leader of the 20th century to recognize both the importance of film as propaganda and its power to communicate quickly and effectively. He understood that audiences did not require literacy to comprehend a film's meaning and that more people could be reached through mass-distributed motion pictures than through any other medium of the time. Lenin declared, "The cinema is for us the most important of the arts," and his government gave top priority to the rapid development of the Soviet film industry, which was nationalized in August 1919 and put under the direct authority of Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. Most of the pre-revolutionary producers had fled to Europe, wrecking their studios as they left and taking their equipment and film stock with them. A foreign blockade prevented the importation of new equipment or stock. There were no domestic facilities for manufacturing either, and massive power shortages restricted the use of what limited resources remained. The Cinema Committee was not deterred, however. Its first act was to found a professional film school in Moscow to train directors, technicians, and actors for the cinema. Vysokoyozny Gosudarstvenny Institute Kinematografii. VGIK, All-Union State Institute of Cinematography. VGIK was the first such school in the world. Initially it trained people in the production of agitki, existing newsreels read for the purpose of agitation and propaganda agitprop. The agitki were transported on specially equipped agit trains and agit steamers to the provinces, where they were exhibited to generate support for the revolution. The years of the Russian Civil War 1918 to 20. Nearly all Soviet films were agitki of some sort. Most of the great directors of the Soviet silent cinema were trained in that form, although, having very little technical equipment and no negative film stock, they were often required to make films without celluloid. Students at the VGIK were instructed to write, direct, and act out scenarios as if they were before cameras. Then on paper they assembled various shots into completed films. The great teacher Lev Kuleshov obtained a print of Griffith's Intolerance and screened it for students in his Kuleshov workshop until they had memorized its shot structures and could rearrange its multilayered editing sequences on paper in hundreds of different combinations. Enter Lev Kuleshov. Kuleshov further experimented with editing by intercutting the same shot of a famous actor's expressionless face with several different shots of highly expressive content: a steaming bowl of soup, a dead girl in a coffin, and a lady laid back on a sofa. The invariable response of film school audiences when shown these sequences was that the actor's face assumed the emotion appropriate to the intercut object. The Kuleshov effect. Kuleshov reasoned from this phenomenon, known today as the Kuleshov effect, that the shot in film always has two values, the one it carries in itself as a photographic image of reality and the one it acquires when placed into juxtaposition with another shot. He reasoned further that the second value is more important to cinematic signification than the first, and that time and space in the cinema must therefore be subordinate to the process of editing, or montage, coined by the Soviets from the French verb monter, to assemble. The disciples of Kuleshov. Although Kuleshov made several important films, including Pozakanu by the Law, 1926, it was as a teacher and theorist that he most deeply influenced an entire generation of Soviet directors. Two of his most brilliant students were Sergei Eisenstein and Vsevolod Pudovkin. Sergei Eisenstein. Eisenstein was, with Griffith, one of the great pioneering geniuses of the modern cinema, and like his predecessor he produced a handful of enduring masterworks. Eisenstein was an intellectual who formulated a modernist theory of editing based on the psychology of perception and Marxist dialectic. He was trained as a civil engineer, but in 1920 he joined the Moscow Proletkult Theater, where he fell under the influence of the stage director Vsevolod Meyerhold and directed a number of plays in the revolutionary style of Futurism. In the winter of 1922-23 Eisenstein studied under Kuleshov and was inspired to write his first theoretical manifesto, The Montage of Attractions. Published in the radical journal Lev, the article advocated assaulting an audience with calculated emotional shocks for the purpose of agitation. Eisenstein was invited to direct the Proletkult-sponsored film Stakha Strike in 1924, but he knew little of the practical aspects of production. He therefore enlisted the aid of Eduard Tissa, a brilliant cinematographer at the state-owned Goskino Studios, beginning a lifelong artistic collaboration. Strike is a semi-documentary representation of the brutal suppression of a strike by Tsarist factory owners and police. In addition to being Eisenstein's first film, it was also the first revolutionary mass film of the new Soviet state. Conceived as an extended montage of shock stimuli, the film concludes with the now famous sequence in which the massacre of the strikers and their families is intercut with shots of cattle being slaughtered in an abattoir. Strike was an immediate success, and Eisenstein was next commissioned to direct a film celebrating the 20th anniversary of the failed 1905 revolution against Tsarism. Originally intended to provide a panorama of the entire event, the project eventually came to focus on a single representative episode: the mutiny of the battleship Potemkin and the massacre of the citizens of the port of Odessa by Tsarist troops. Bronnosets Potemkin. Battleship Potemkin, 1925, emerged as one of the most important and influential films ever made, especially in Eisenstein's use of montage, which had improved far beyond the formulaic, if effective, juxtapositions of Strike. Sergei Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. Although agitational to the core, Battleship Potemkin is a work of extraordinary pictorial beauty and great elegance of form. It is symmetrically broken into 5 movements or acts, according to the structure of Greek tragedy. Men and maggots, the flagrant mistreatment of the sailors at the hands of their officers is demonstrated. Drama on the quarterdeck presents the actual mutiny and the ship's arrival in Odessa. Appeal from the Dead establishes the solidarity of the citizens of Odessa with the mutineers. The Odessa Steps, which depicts the massacre of the citizens, that thrust Eisenstein and his film into the historical eminence that both occupy today. Meeting the Squadron, in which the battleship Potemkin in a show of brotherhood is allowed to pass through the squadron unharmed, is anticlimactic. Battleship Potemkin's The Odessa Steps. Unquestionably the most famous sequence of its kind in film history, The Odessa Steps incarnates the theory of dialectical montage that Eisenstein later expounded in his collected writings, The Film Sense 1942 and Film Form 1949. Eisenstein believed that meaning in motion pictures is generated by the collision of opposing shots. He compared this dialectical process in film editing to the series of explosions of an internal combustion engine, driving forward its automobile or tractor. The force of the Odessa Steps arises when the viewer's mind combines individual, independent shots and forms a new, distinct conceptual impression that far outweighs the shot's narrative significance. The agitational appeal of Battleship Potemkin became nearly irresistible, and, when exported in early 1926, it made Eisenstein world famous. Sergei Eisenstein's October, 1928. Eisenstein's next project, October, 1928, was commissioned by the Central Committee to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. When the film was completed in November 1927, it was just under 4 hours long. While Eisenstein was making October, however, Joseph Stalin had taken control of the Politburo from Leon Trotsky, and the director was forced to cut the print by 1/3 to eliminate references to the exiled Trotsky. Eisenstein had consciously used October as a laboratory for experimenting with intellectual or ideological montage, an abstract type of editing in which the relationships established between shots are conceptual rather than visual or emotional. When the film was finally released, however, Stalinist critics attacked this alleged formalist excess aestheticism or elitism. The same charge was leveled even more bitterly against Eisenstein's next film, Staroye Novold and New 1929, which Stalinist bureaucrats completely disavowed. Stalin hated Eisenstein because he was an intellectual and a Jew, but the director's international stature was such that he could not be publicly purged. Instead, Stalin used the Soviet state subsidy apparatus to foil Eisenstein's projects and attack his principles at every turn, a situation that resulted in the director's failure to complete another film until Alexander Nevsky was commissioned in 1938. Vsevolod Pudovkin. Eisenstein's nearest rival in the Soviet silent cinema was his fellow student Vsevolod Pudovkin. Like Eisenstein, Pudovkin developed a new theory of montage, but one based on cognitive linkage rather than dialectical collision. He maintained that the film is not shot, but built up from the separate strips of celluloid that are its raw material. Pudovkin most often used montage for narrative rather than symbolic purpose. His films are more personal than Eisenstein's. The epic drama that is the focus of Eisenstein's films exists in Pudovkin's films merely to provide a backdrop for the interplay of human emotions. Pudovkin's major work is Mat Mother, 1926. A tale of strike-breaking and terrorism in which a woman loses first her husband and then her son to the opposing sides of the 1905 revolution. The film was internationally acclaimed for the innovative intensity of its montage, as well as for its emotion and lyricism. Pudovkin's later films included Konec St. Peterburg, The End of St. Petersburg, 1927, which, like Eisenstein's October, was commissioned to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Potomac Chingiskina, The Heir to Genghis Khan, or Storm Over Asia, 1928, which is set in Central Asia during the Russian Civil War. Although Pudovkin was never persecuted as severely by the Stalinists as Eisenstein, he too was publicly charged with formalism for his experimental sound film Prostoy Sluchay, a Simple Case, 1932, which he was forced to release without its soundtrack. Pudovkin made several more sound films but remains best known for his silent work. Other seminal figures of the Soviet silent era. Pudovkin's major work is Mat Mother, 1926, a tale of strike-breaking and terrorism in which a woman loses first her husband and then her son to the opposing sides of the 1905 revolution. Dovzhenko, the son of Ukrainian peasants, had been a political cartoonist and painter before becoming a director at the state-controlled Odessa studios in 1926. After several minor works, he made Zvenigora 1928, a collection of boldly stylized tales about a hunt for an ancient Scythian treasure set during 4 different stages of Ukrainian history, Arsenal 1929, an epic film poem about the effects of revolution and civil war upon the Ukraine, and Zemlya Earth, 1930, which is considered to be his masterpiece. Zhizhia Vertov, a pseudonym meaning spinning top, was an artist of quite different talents. He began his career as an agitki photographer and newsreel editor and is now acknowledged as the father of cinema verite, a self-consciously realistic documentary movement of the 1960s and 70s for his development and practice of the theory of the kinoglas cinema. Vertov articulated this doctrine in the early 1920s in a number of radical manifestos in which he denounced conventional narrative cinema as impotent and demanded that it be replaced with a cinema of actuality based on the organization of camera-recorded documentary material. Unlike most of his contemporaries, Vertov welcomed the coming of sound, envisioning it as a radio ear to accompany the cinema. His first sound film, Enthusiasm Symphonia Donbass's Symphony of the Donbass, 1931, was an extraordinary contribution to the new medium, as was Tri Pesny o Lenin, 3 songs about Lenin, 1934, yet Vertov could not escape the charge of formalist error any more than his peers. Although he did make the feature film Kolibelnaya Lullaby in 1937, for the most part the Stalinist establishment reduced him to the status of a newsreel photographer after 1934. Other Soviet filmmakers. Many other Soviet filmmakers played important roles in the great decade of experiment that followed the revolution, among them Grigory Kozintsev and Leonid Trauberg, Boris Barnett, Yakov Protazanov, Olga Preobrazhenskaya, Abram Room, and the documentarian Esther Shub. The period came to an abrupt end in 1929, when Stalin removed the State Film Trust, then called Sovkino, from the jurisdiction of the Commissariat of Education and placed it under the direct authority of the Supreme Council of the National Economy. Decline of Soviet cinema. Reorganized as Soyuz Kino, the trust was turned over to the reactionary bureaucrat Boris Shumyatsky, a proponent of the narrowly ideological doctrine known as socialist realism. This policy, which came to dominate the Soviet arts, dictated that individual creativity be subordinated to the political aims of the party and the state. In practice, it militated against the symbolic, the experimental, and the avant-garde in favor of a literal-minded people's art that glorified representative Soviet heroes and idealized Soviet experience. The restraints imposed made it impossible for the great filmmakers of the post-revolutionary era to produce creative or innovative work, and the Soviet cinema went into decline.
With all that, we have reached the end of our topic. Thank you for joining Film History MOOC. See you all next teaching video. Thank you and all the best.